Good evening, everyone, and a very big welcome to the Fathering Project and to our webinar tonight on how to build resilience in your life and train your brain. We welcome Dr. Justine Gatt, who is a Senior Research Scientist and a Group Leader of the Gatt Resilience Lab at Neuroscience Research Australia, NEURA. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to run through a few quick housekeeping rules. I'm sure you will have many questions through this amazing presentation tonight. But so we can have a bit of order, you can see on your right-hand side there is a panel, and you can see where you can actually type a message. At any time that you have a question, please just type the message and send it. The webinar will run for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will go to open question time. So please send us your questions and we will try our very best to get through as many as we can. Now, before we get started, I would just like to take a chance to tell you a little bit about our Senior Research Scientist tonight, Dr. Justine Gatt. Justine completed her PhD in psychology at the University of Sydney. She completed then 3 years postdoctoral training in genetics and neuroimaging at the Brain Dynamics Centre at Westmead Hospital and the University of Sydney. She has since been successful in obtaining 2 very competitive national research fellowships. The first, the ARC Linkage Postdoctoral Fellowship in Emotional Wellbeing in Twins, and the second, an NHMRC Career Development Fellowship in the Neuroscience Genetics of Resilience. So in 2014, she moved to the School of Psychology at the University of New South Wales with a co-joint position at NEURA. And in 2016, she was promoted to Group Leader, a Senior Research Scientist at NEURA, Neuroscience Research Australia, as well as a Senior Lecturer at the University of New South Wales, where she currently leads several national and international projects, all in resilience and wellbeing. So much already achieved in one lifetime. We cannot wait to hear how we can train our brains to be more resilient. Let me introduce you to our guest speaker tonight, Senior Research Scientist, Dr. Justine Gatt.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for the invitation to present tonight, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us. So, as Liz mentioned, tonight I'm going to be talking about how to build resilience in your life and how to train your brain. And I'm going to be touching on a lot of the research that our team has been conducting over the past few years, and as well as provide you some resilience tips, improving resilience in your own life towards the end. So to begin with, I'm just going to provide a little bit of context about mental health in the general population. And generally speaking, anxiety and depression are the most common mental health disorders in the general population, with up to 29% of the population suffering from anxiety or mood disorders at least once in their lifetime. And these prevalence rates start to rise, particularly during late adolescence, with up to 7% of 11 to 15-year-olds and 20% of 16 to 17-year-olds reporting their first clinical symptoms, and which then peak in early adulthood. So right here, we've got a continuum of mental health. So this just shows the percentage of the population that has different forms or severity of mental illness versus mental health. And that down the bottom here, which is circled in red, you'll see that that's the quarter of the population that are usually diagnosed with some sort of mental health disorder at any given point in time. And then what we find is the rest of the population, which we are normally categorizing as healthy, actually vary quite a lot in terms of their levels of well-being. And the people that our group are particularly interested in understanding are those who have high well-being, so they're flourishing and doing really well. So what we want to do is understand how they are coping with stress and perhaps if we can learn how they're doing things differently, perhaps we can teach those people who are a little bit more vulnerable. So to begin with, what is well-being? We usually hear the word well-being often in social media, but to define it, there are actually two key components of well-being. First, we have subjective well-being. So this is what you usually hear in various kind of media reports, you know, the whole concept of happiness and how satisfied we are with our life. But in addition to that, we have psychological well-being. So this defines those kind of things such as what gives us our life purpose, our levels of autonomy, our levels of mastery and self-acceptance. And together they form what we define as mental well-being. Now, when we're talking about resilience, how does this actually differ from well-being? So this is the graph that I just showed you earlier. So we've got those people who are up here on the top end of the spectrum who are doing really well. And when we're talking about resilience, we're actually talking about if you're given some sort of adversity or you're dealing with some sort of significant stress, it's those people who are actually able to adapt from that stress that we define as high resilience. So you can see the concepts of well-being and resilience are actually quite closely related. And the problem is the word resilience is also thrown around quite a lot, and the definitions of it vary quite a lot in the literature. So to begin with, just to make it clear that resilience is actually not just a coping mechanism. So it's not whether or not you're hardy, and it's not something that only some people are born with. It's actually the process of adaptive recovery following adversity. So it's a process, it's not necessarily a trait. So it's a series of steps that we take to effectively deal with stress and to thrive for optimal levels of well-being. So now I'm just going to give you an example because it's really hard to define resilience as a process or to even understand what I mean by that. So here we've got a lovely picture of a beautiful chocolate cake, and the process of actually creating this cake involves quite a few steps. So you need to have the necessary ingredients to make the cake. You need to have the utensils to mix the ingredients together. You need to have the right equipment, so such as an oven to actually bake the cake. And then you need to put all those steps into action and combine them to actually create your cake. So in this case, the cake is actually our levels of well-being. So that's the thing that we're trying to achieve in the end. And resilience are all those different types of processes contributing to well-being. So in terms of, instead of ingredients, it's our personality, it's the personality of the person. It's our coping styles that we use to deal with stress. It's the resources and the social support that we access then to actually deal with the stressor. So all of these processes together are what define as resilience. So my quest of our research program is actually to decode well-being and resilience in the brain. And then once we understand that, we can actually build resilience in people in different contexts. So why is resilience so important right now? I probably don't need to explain all the types of stress that we all deal with every day. And if you think about 20 to 30 years ago, we didn't even have the internet. So right now, everything's a lot faster. We've got a lot more communication right at our fingertips. And we need to deal with high work demands and traffic and all those kind of things. And not to mention this year, we of course, got COVID. You can't escape that. So all of these sort of things are stresses and adversities that we all need to deal with right now. So why is understanding resilience so important to me? And as all of you are parents, as am I imagine you look at your child and you want to be able to protect them as much as you possibly can, because you know of all the things that they possibly could experience in this world, and they're just so innocent, you know, looking at you like everything's, you know, quite a joyful thing to experience. But the problem is with, if you even recall back to your own schooling, you probably were never even taught how to deal with stress effectively. You know, you weren't taught mindfulness or meditation on all those kind of coping mechanisms. And the good thing is a lot of these things are starting to be introduced into schools right now, but there is no standard course curriculum that is actually embedded in every school to teach resilience and wellbeing. So this is why it's so crucial to understand. So as I said before, our research program is pretty much trying to put all these kind of pieces together. So we're looking at our genetics, you know, the things in our actual genes, how it combines with our environment, which is stress, for instance, how that impacts our brain, and we look at brain functioning in various different ways, and then how they all combine to actually create well-being and resilience over time. Now, one particular study that I'm going to talk to you about that we've been working on for over the past 10 years is the Twin adult twin study. And this is a study that we conducted in over 1,600 healthy adult twins across Australia. And it included both identical twins and non-identical twins. So I've got an example here of identical twins, and these are actual brain scans of identical twins. These aren't the actual twins corresponding to the brains, but if you happen to look at these brains, you can see you virtually can't even see the differences between the brains. So you can see how identical they actually are. And here is an example of non-identical twins. So non-identical twins are just as similar as a normal sibling pair. So a normal sister and brother pair, or sister and sister pair, or brother and brother. And so here the differences between the brains are a lot more obvious. And in these particular twins, what we did, we collected quite a lot of measures. We looked at, we collected questionnaire measures that they did online. They did some cognitive tests online as well. They provided their saliva to give us their DNA. And a bunch of the twins also came into our lab, and they did some EEG and MRI brain scans. Now, one of the first outcomes from this study was the development of this wellbeing questionnaire that we call Compass W. And the reason that we created this questionnaire was we wanted to be able to capture both subjective and psychological wellbeing in the one tool, because what we found was wellbeing was usually measured just using one type of measure, and we wanted to make sure we had a complete picture of what wellbeing looked like. So this particular questionnaire, it has 26 items, so you can get a total score of wellbeing. And we can also look at 6 subdimensions of wellbeing. So these are composure, so that's how you deal with stress, your own worth, which is kind of like a self-esteem measure, mastery, which is an example of how much you feel you can control your environment, positivity, so that's your happiness dimension, achievement, which is goal striving, and then satisfaction, so that's how satisfied you are with different domains of your life, such as work and relationships. Now, I'm just going to give you here a few examples of the items from this scale. So this is just one item from each of the subdimensions. And if you have a read through some of these, hopefully you'll be answering yes to most of them. So that means you're higher in wellbeing than lower in the spectrum. But as I said, we have 26 of these items, so this is just a small sample of some of them. So for instance, as an example, when we measure composure during stress, what we're looking at is if you're faced with a stressful situation, what are the kind of things that you do to actually make yourself keep calm, or do you get really tense and irritable? So that's one way of looking at it. And in terms of positivity, it's how much you actually laugh. If you laugh quite easily, are you quite a cheerful person, or are they opposite? So these are kind of examples of what we're looking at. So our research is trying to understand what determines higher wellbeing. Is it our genetics? Is it our environment, or is it a combination? Is it the types of things that we do to look after ourselves, like our diet and exercise? Is it how our brain actually processes information that we deal with every day? And once we understand all of that, how do we actually promote increased well-being? So to begin with, I'm going to go through these 4 dimensions and just go through some of the evidence so you can understand where we are up to in terms of understanding well-being. So first, in terms of genetics versus environment. Now, these are some published studies. Usually they're in twin studies when we're looking at heritability. So heritability is the percentage of genetic variation that's contributing to that particular trait. And in this case, we're looking at different mental health disorders. So if you look at, for instance, the highest ones with the highest load of genetic contribution would be ADHD and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Then we have the anxiety disorders, and major depression is around 40%, so it's a moderate genetic contribution. And then when we're looking at well-being, it's similar to anxiety and depression. So, but it can even be, it has been reported to be lower. So it can range anywhere from 25 to 50%. So that means, therefore, that the rest of the variance, the rest of the percentage is actually due to environments. So we still have some contribution of environment to these higher disorders such as ADHD and schizophrenia, but there's a larger proportion of environment contributing to anxiety, depression, and our levels of well-being. And in terms of the wellbeing scale that I just mentioned that we created, we also, because we have twins and we developed it in twins, we're able to look at heritability in that particular scale. And what we found was the heritability of total wellbeing was actually 48%. So it's almost 50-50 gene environment contribution to our levels of wellbeing. And then if you look at the different subdimensions, they vary a little bit more. So genetic contribution to how you deal with stress is a lot lower than things such as how satisfied you are with your life and levels of positivity. So in our twin sample, this is just some preliminary results that we are currently trying to publish at the moment. And so what we did was look at the actual DNA of our twins, and we conducted what is called a GWAS. So it's a genome-wide association study. So it's looking at all the genes that you have, well, all the ones that we could identify in our genome, and we're trying to actually identify what's actually associated with well-being. And we found these particular genes here that they've got the a lot of the digits alongside them, and these corresponding chromosomes that these genes are actually sitting on. And with GWAS studies, you need to be able to run those kind of studies. You need hundreds of thousands of people to have the power to actually run this kind of analysis. And in this analysis, it's just in our twin sample of 1,600 twins. So we don't have the sample size to do the kind of analysis that's displayed here. But even despite that, we found these genetic hits, is what they call them, that correspond to our levels of well-being. And this is independent of any measures of anxiety or depression. So that just essentially just provides evidence that the two things are quite different. Your well-being, anxiety, depression, two different things, and they're driven and determined by two different things. Now, in terms of environment, so we have, as we know, we all have different forms of stress that we need to deal with. And these are sort of the three types of stress that you can kind of bundle them all into. The first one, which is probably the worst one, that is associated with the worst risk of mental health disorders, is exposure to childhood trauma. And 1 in 5 people have actually reported generally that they have experienced this at some point in their life up to the age of 18. So these are the kind of experiences that our sample could possibly report. So it could be neglect, abuse, family conflict, bullying in the school, as well as health problems. Then as we move on into adulthood, 1 in 2 people actually report these kind of significant traumas. So these are assault, natural disasters, warfare, injuries, car accidents, and those kind of major type of events. And then what we all experience are daily hassles. So it's not how many people actually experience these sort of things, it's how often we all experience them. And generally speaking, this is pre-COVID, we all experience 1 for half of any given week. So you can see how often we all are dealing with these sort of things, such as relationship conflicts, financial stress, work demands, just dealing with arguments with various people, and all those kind of things, even down to traffic fines. Now, in another study that we conducted, we wanted to actually understand what was more detrimental, our childhood trauma or our adult trauma, in determining our levels of anxiety. So this is a general population sample. They're healthy people, technically speaking, so they don't have any mental health disorders. But even though they don't have any mental health disorders, what we found was, so we've got this anxiety going up on the side of the graph, and down the bottom we have the group that has, on the far left, those who have no trauma at all experience. Then we go up to just adult trauma. And then when you see the biggest jump is when they actually reported they had childhood trauma only, not adult trauma. And it's there that you see the biggest jump in anxiety disorders. And then when you add on childhood and adult trauma, you can see that the difference actually doesn't add much. So it's a childhood trauma that actually is the most significant risk factor for developing mental health disorders. And in terms of well-being, we looked at the same kind of trends, but in terms of well-being scores. So again, we got on the left well-being on the side axis, and then along the bottom, the same kind of combinations. So we have no child or adult trauma on the left, and they have the highest well-being, of course. Then if you experience adult trauma versus childhood trauma, and then their combination, that's the worst levels of well-being, as we see right here. And actually, again, like with anxiety, it was when we looked at childhood trauma that we found the actual significant difference from the absence of trauma, as well as combining child and adult trauma that also was significantly different in reducing our levels of well-being. So both are important in this case. So what is the impact of stress? So obviously when we talk about stress, usually it's assumed that stress is bad. But actually, if you look at this in terms of performance, we do actually need a certain amount of stress, for instance, to focus on work tasks. And this peak level of stress that each person needs is going to vary with each person. So usually you would find, for instance, if you had a deadline, you might find you'd be able to concentrate a lot more just before the deadline is due, because it enables you to actually focus on the task. So that's a bit of stress, but you kind of need it to actually get at your peak performance. If you didn't have that level of stress, you actually probably be quite bored with your job. But then again, if you had too much, you'll burn out, and that's when you have high risk for anxiety and depression, if that happens on a chronic basis. Now, in terms of environment, there's also protective positive factors. So these are 3 key types of environmental factors that we could seek out to actually boost our well-being, or they're like a protective mechanism towards higher resilience. And these include things such as an enriched and stimulating environments, particularly in childhood. If you have, if you imagine if you had a child sitting in a house with just 4 walls versus another child sitting in a house with, they've got the outdoor gym, they've got a gardening area, cooking station, all those kind of things, that's quite an enriching, stimulating environment. And then the second and most important thing is having a positive and secure relationships with their primary caregivers. At least one caregiver is important to have that secure relationship as they are growing up, as well as receiving their social support from their teachers and peers, as well as other things such as having strong community values or religious values, all those kind of things. And then the final thing, as we are growing up, what we need actually is positive support at major life transition points. So these are things such as when you're about to leave school, or when you're about to start your first job, or when you're about to get married, or those kind of key transition points. If you had someone there that was supporting you through those transitions and changes, they are another factor that's considered protective. Now we're going to move to physical health factors and basic kind of demographic information. So what we've done with our wellbeing scales, we looked at how does wellbeing differ between men and women, different ages, and if you're single versus married. And we've got some interesting trends here. So firstly, in terms of males and females, we didn't find any difference in levels of wellbeing between men and women. They were almost identical. What we did find, though, was that wellbeing actually increases with age. So we've got our 18 to 30-year-old group down the bottom here on the left. Then we've got this sort of midlife slump, as we see, like the midlife crisis. And then suddenly, when you're over 50 or 60, suddenly it springs back up again and you're a lot happier again. I'm not sure why that happens, but that's the trend we're finding. And then in terms of marital status, what we find that those who have the lowest well-being are those who are actually widowed recently. And then following that, it's those who've just been separated, so from their marriage. Up above that is those who are single, then divorced, and then those who are actually in de facto, or I imagine happily married people, have the highest levels of well-being. Now, in terms of actual physical and psychological indicators, what we did in this case is we looked at those who were on the extreme ends of our wellbeing scale. So we've got the ones who are on the lowest end of the scale, so we call them the languishing group, and then we've got those on the right, which is the flourishing. So these are the ones with the highest levels of wellbeing. And generally what we found was as we would predict. So those who were languishing had higher anxiety and depression. They suppressed their emotions more when they were stressed. And they also didn't have the best physical health. So they ate fast foods 3 to 5 times a week. They had less than 5 hours sleep per night. They only exercised, if they exercised at all, it was up to 2 times per week. And they also reported low work productivity. So they went to work, but when they were there, their productivity was pretty poor. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have those who are flourishing. So these are the ones who are doing really well in wellbeing, and they also showed a pattern of lower anxiety, depression. They had less emotional suppression and were able to appraise their emotions a lot better when they're dealing with stress. They didn't have any fast foods. They had a decent night's sleep, and they exercised regularly. And they were also less likely to be absent from work. Okay, so now we're moving on to the brain. And when we're looking at the brain in terms of research, these are the 3 key networks, is what we call them, in various mental health disorders that are usually impacted in different ways depending on the disorder that you're looking at. So by network, what I mean is there are certain regions in the brain that are usually signaling to each other or reacting to each other when we are confronted with certain things in our environment. So the threat network is usually activated when, say, someone's coming at us that is quite angry or potentially threatening. So it could be a snake, it could be, any of those things that are naturally going to cause us stress. Then we have the reward network. So here we go, another lovely piece of cake. And these are the kind of things that we want to enjoy. So they're foods, but the other problem with these are the things that are usually drugs of addiction. So they're also targeting the reward network. And then the other network is the executive function network. So this is more involved when we're, for instance, thinking, when we're trying to set our goals, when we're trying to remember certain things and prioritize and organize. So it's a thinking part of our brain. So these different networks are all triggered in different situations, and in mental illness, they are altered. And so what we think, or what we're predicting in well-being, that these networks are actually functioning optimally. So the opposite. So how do we actually look at these networks in the brain? Now, normally what we do is we have different tasks that actually trigger those different networks, and we can give them to people as a little game that they complete online. So it's like a performance task, or they're given the games while they've got an EEG cap, or they're in the MRI scanner, and they're all trying to get at the same thing. So you might, for instance, have a memory task that you need to remember it. So it's triggering parts of your brain involved in memory. Whereas the emotion task, the type of task we normally do is that we actually show different emotional expressions. So a happy face would trigger one part of the brain, whereas an angry face would trigger another. And they're all, as well as attention, so they're all looking at different kind of aspects of those networks. And in terms of our twin study, we've been looking at our wellbeing scale and all these networks using all different types of measures. So as I mentioned before, these are all different studies that we've published or are currently publishing focusing on this. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but I'm just going to give you some examples. So for instance, with higher wellbeing, we found that those people who had higher wellbeing had better cognitive performance. That was in terms of having sustained attention, they had better cognitive flexibility, and they also even had just basic, faster motor coordination. That's just looking at tapping tasks. So it's literally finger tapping, and they're just able to do that a lot more quickly. The people who had high well-being also responded faster to happy faces, as we would predict. They also showed a particular difference in when we're looking at brain structure. So volume of different brain regions actually differed with levels of well-being. And in this study, this was the region, if you see on the right-hand side of the yellow little blob, that's called the pons. So it's part of the brainstem. And we found people who had lower well-being had higher well-being had a lower pons. And that part of the brain is actually involved in sensory processing. So it's involved in our sleep and our levels of arousal and heart rate and all those kind of things. And some other patterns, we've looked at EEG. So this is the bottom brains on the right-hand side. So we're looking at actual brain activity across the scalp, and we're finding quite strong patterns across those as well. And that pattern's been associated with a lower anxiety. And as I said before, we're also looking at the genetics of well-being. So now I'm going to just move to ways you can actually promote well-being in your own life. So building on this compass well-being scale that I mentioned before, we have this framework of 6 key principles that you can adopt to actually build well-being and resilience in your life. And I'm going to go through each of those right now just to give you an example of how you can actually apply these principles to your own life. So the first one is composure. As I said, this is how you deal with stress. So as we all know, when we're stressed, there are good ways of dealing with stress, so adaptive coping mechanisms, and then there are bad ways. So the better ways of dealing with stress are things such as active problem solving, using humor to diffuse any sort of tension, and using kind of relaxation techniques such as yoga and those kind of things. Whereas the not so good ways of coping with stress are things such as avoiding the problem, denying the problem, blaming yourself, constantly venting and complaining about other people, but also using substances of abuse to deal with it. So that's alcohol, smoking, those kind of things. So the best way to, I guess, promote better stress or composure is to have a bit more conscious awareness of when you are stressed and how you actually deal with it. So what you need to do is, when you're starting to get stressed, start becoming aware of how your body is reacting, because that's the first symptoms that will emanate when you're starting to get stressed. It's your physiological system. So when you're stressed, for instance, your hands will start to sweat, your heart rate will raise, you're going to start getting really irritated and annoyed with people. And those are the signs that you should start being aware of when you're starting to become stressed, because when you start recognizing that in yourself, it gives you a chance to actually stop and think, okay, am I actually dealing with this in the best possible way? Can I actually deal with it in a better, effective way? So you break those habits and you actually try and deal with the stress more adaptively. Now, the second dimension, own worth. So this is about identifying who you are as a person. So it's all about your self-worth. So it's identifying what you stand for, what your values are. Because once you understand what those are, it's really important to preserve boundaries around those when you're dealing with other people. So that's learning how to be assertive rather than aggressive or passive-aggressive when you just want to get your values addressed. So it's learning how to say no when someone is trying to, for instance, perhaps take advantage of you, or knowing when you need to actually seek help or support to deal with your situation. But it's also about self-compassion. There's a lot of work now looking at self-compassion. And it's about just having compassion for yourself when things don't work out. And there's always going to be a situation when things aren't going to go as planned. And what you need to ask yourself is, in those situations, are you actually kicking yourself and saying, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. Why did I do it like that? Or are you thinking, okay, what did I do? What can I learn from this situation? How can I deal with it differently? There are two very different ways of dealing with situations, and it can change how you really perceive yourself and your levels of self-confidence. So it's something to be really mindful of as you're dealing with people. Now, the third one is mastery. So this is about essentially your levels of self-confidence. So how much control you feel you have over your environment, how much control you actually feel you have over your life. And this is a huge thing that's being challenged right now with COVID, because it's such an uncontrollable thing. But even while that's going on, what we need to focus on are our strengths. So we identify what our strengths are. Can we actually build those? And then what are our weaknesses? We all have weaknesses. And some of them, they're not things you can deal with. They're not things you can change. But there are some weaknesses that you can master. And they might be, for instance, my biggest weakness when I was younger was shyness. I was so shy, and it really was a roadblock for me getting anywhere ahead, for instance, throughout university. And so what I thought was, okay, I'm going to have to get out of my comfort zone and deal with this, because it's just starting to become a huge problem. So what I did was I actually took on a course in conversation taking. And what I found was, even though I probably didn't even learn any new skills in conversation taking, what I actually learned was there was a whole lot of people having the same issue as me, which was really comforting. But also I learned that I actually could create conversations. I already had the skills. It was more of a fear that I didn't have them. So it's just overcoming that fear. And so once you do that, it builds your self-confidence. You just get better and better. And finally, the other thing with mastery is being self-reliant. Now, this is about keeping happiness in your own pocket. And what that means is not outsourcing your happiness to your partners or your children, but it's having your own independent interests and goals and sources of inspiration. Now, the reason this is important is because if, for instance, your relationship breaks down or your children start to leave home, you're not going to crumble, because you already have your own separate life and you have your own interests. And so therefore it's a much healthier way of having relationships with people, because you have your own independent space. Now, the fourth one is positivity. So this is a really easy one. It's optimism, it's being able to smile and laugh, it's having a positive outlook. And you find with COVID, with all the social media, you're probably seeing so many stories about COVID, the number of cases it's impacting. And I think my best suggestion to deal with that is to not even look at those, because it's starting to become a blur to me anyway. The other things you can do is schedule then, therefore, time for fun. So think about all the things that you really enjoy doing and actually schedule them in your diary, so you have something to look forward to, even if you're working from home. And at the end of the day or week, you can create positive to-do lists and achievement lists to think of things that you have accomplished rather than things you need to do. Now, the fifth one is achievement. So this is about identifying your life purpose, your talents and your interests. So it's about what really drives you, what you're passionate about, and what really excites you. So those kind of things that, you know, when you get so involved in the activity that you forget your phone, you forget everything else that's going on because you're so much in the zone of what you're concentrating on. And it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be work. It could be baking, it could be singing, it could be dancing, whatever it is. But you need to identify what those things are to you so that you can do them on a continuous basis. And then you've got to set goals to actually achieve them and to make sure that they are things that you want to do and they're things because you want to do it because it satisfies your needs, not because of, you know, satisfying someone else's. So for instance, you're not exercising and going to gym just so you look good for someone else. It's because you're doing it for yourself, and that's the crucial thing right here. And finally, the sixth dimension is satisfaction. So we've got to remember with mental health, our physical health is crucial as well because they interact. So we've got to remember to look after our body. It's having a healthy diet, sleep, exercise. It's being mindful and present in the moment. So mindfulness. If you're not familiar with mindfulness, it's such a crucial strategy that you can implement if you're dealing with stress, but also just it's a strategy that you should just develop even when you're relaxed. And it's about remembering your five senses. So if you want to remember it, just think of your five senses. You got sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. And so it's focusing on those and nothing else. So for instance, if you're going out to dinner, you've got your meal, you want to look at your meal, you want to see how it tastes, how it touches, how it smells, and what you're hearing around you. That is being present in the moment. And finally, practice gratitude. So these are, you know, having a gratitude diary, looking at all the things that you've achieved and all the good things that are actually happening in your life. So this is just a summary of all these tips. If you wanted to have a look or take a screenshot of this, so that everything I've pretty much just explained, they're little examples. We also, I think, have a copy of this on my website at Neura. If you want to download it, you can also do that. Now, just because we're all going through COVID and you might be concerned about your child, particularly if they're still in isolation, in different states, we're all on various levels of restrictions. So I thought I'd just give you some tips. These are things that I did with my child also that I found quite helpful. So for instance, if they can't see their friends, it's really helpful to have regular communication with their friends or family, with FaceTiming, to validate if they're feeling. So if they're, you know, expressing some sort of anxiety to you, validate that those things are valid feelings to experience. They could do journaling or writing, so they can handwrite letters to their friends or plan activities that they want to do when they're not in isolation. You can have challenging group activities that you do all together. So family competitions such as cake baking, drawing competitions, YouTube yoga, dance classes. One thing my daughter wanted to do, she wanted to always have a competition between myself and her baking cakes. So we both had to bake a cake each, and she wanted to see who did the better cake. And I was just more concerned about eating 2 cakes in the same week. But it was such a really enjoyable experience. So any of those kind of activities, I think, would really work well. Another thing is parent parallel play. So I don't know if your child, depending on what age your child is, they have a lot of games, online gaming they could do, or you can actually do, and what I've done actually is I've become I played one of these games with my daughter also because I wanted to actually play with her, but also just see the environment and the types of other players that she's dealing with, because there's bullying even in these online games, even these people that they haven't even met before. But it's good to just understand that kind of environment and what they're dealing with. Now, finally, the other thing is to enable healthy ways to relieve tension and anger. Now, as we know, with the human brain, the frontal part of your brain is the last part to be fully developed. And that doesn't happen until our 20s. So that is the part of the brain that actually helps us control our emotions. So you can imagine your poor child is probably really annoyed, or that when they get really angry, they don't know how to deal with it. It's just a whole lot of emotion, or they're getting really, they're getting really upset and they're crying. They don't know how to express it because they don't have the capacity yet to actually deal with an emotion. So I think when you see your child, getting upset, they get, really cranky quite easily. I think it's just to have compassion for them, know that they're going through a bit of a tough time, and maybe you can create a healthy way to just let that tension out, even if it's a punching bag, whatever it is, but some way to let them know that it's okay to feel like that. Okay, so the 3 key takeouts to remember is that we're not born resilient, so anyone can build resilience. The Compass Wellbeing measure is something that you could use to both measure wellbeing and build resilience to stress in our life. And increasing wellbeing can promote resilience to stress across children and adults alike. So I'd like to just acknowledge our huge team that contributed to this work over the years. And it's just been a really enjoyable experience, and I just continue to love what I do. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Justine. We actually have some questions now from our listeners. So I've got a few here. I might just kick off. I've got one here from Daniel, and it does relate to stress and adapting to stress. So his question is, you mentioned, Justine, that flourishing people are able to adapt when faced with stress. Does that mean that these people are able to change, or that they are able to continue being themselves when faced with stress? And if they do change, how do they change?
They might. I mean, when we're all going through stress, you're not going to be happy and content in that moment. So it's natural to, I think, feel tense in that moment. But what someone who would deal with stress better, I guess they would have better coping mechanisms, or they might be able to regulate their emotions better. So they might be a bit more balanced, a bit more peaceful dealing with one situation versus another person who is lower in well-being, and they just could be a complete mess dealing with the same situation. You could see them just crumbling as they're being completely nonsensical. So they can be quite differences between people.
Right, thank you. I've got more questions here. I've got a question here from Megan. From the twin work that you did, the twin study, are we saying then that we are born more resilient or not born more resilient? I think you mentioned at the end that it was shown that people aren't, but were you able to clarify?
Yeah, so essentially what we found was, because we had twins, we were able to compare whether or not the contribution of genetics versus environment and well-being. And what we found was well-being was 48% due to genetics. So essentially, we're not necessarily born resilient, no. It's a contribution to both our genetics and our environment that contributes to our well-being.
Right, thank you for clarifying. So I've got one here from Michael. If we can all work to develop resilience, and if we start now, does it take a long time to train our brain, or is it something that happens quite quickly?
Well, I guess there are various strategies you could use to develop resilience. So it really depends on what you're doing. But for example, for mindfulness training. Now, there's a lot of evidence to actually show that it doesn't take that long to get the benefits from it. So, for instance, there was one particular study where they found that if you practice mindfulness for just 10 minutes a day for just 10 days, you're already showing significant improvements in your mental health and well-being. So I would suggest starting with that kind of activity and then building on from there. So the more you do, the better, and the quicker, I guess, you can train your brain.
Great. Thank you. Now, we've got a question here about teenagers from Lucy. What age groups have you tested the wellbeing scale in? So Lucy has 3 teenagers and she thinks it would be most helpful and wants to know, is it for all age groups or just for adults?
Okay, it's a great question. So far we've tested the wellbeing scale in adults and adolescents as young as 12 years of age. But we've just finished developing a kids version and a parents version of the scale to use in children as young as 5 years of age. So that's something we're actually testing out in different clinical groups over the coming year. So hopefully that will be available next year.
That's great. And the Compass scale, is that something, I mean, have you seen that as an app anywhere online? Is it something people could perhaps have on their phones, or how do you suggest people kind of keep mindful of the Compass scale?
Yeah, another good question. So we're actually building an app right now, and so it will include the Compass scale in it, so you'll be able to get a score. Plus, it'll have all these types of activities that I mentioned and a lot more that you could use to train your brain, to train well-being and resilience each day. But I think that app will probably be ready in about 6 months for public use. So if you're interested in using that kind of app, please just keep an eye on our research group, particularly early next year, because I think that's when we would have the app actually available to use.
That does sound really exciting.
Yeah.
Is it something, do you think, that would be relevant for children and teenagers as well, or is it mostly targeted for adults at this stage?
I think adolescents will be able to use it once we've tested it and saw what's working and what's not working. We actually want to then tailor it to younger kids. So with younger kids, the activities will obviously be quite different. So that would just take a bit of time, but that's exactly where I want this work to go.
Okay, that's great. Well, I think that was actually our last question, Justine. So I might hand it over to Liz, who's did our introduction. So over to you now, Liz.
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say thank you so much, Justine, for such an insightful webinar tonight. So many thoughts have come from it. And I think it's incredibly relevant at the moment because, being able to even do something 10 minutes a day for 10 days to start looking after our well-being and building our resilience while we're going through such challenging times. And I think also for those parents listening, to be able to also help our children to take up some of these suggestions can only be beneficial. So thank you very much to our Senior Researcher Scientist, Dr. Justine Gatt, for joining us tonight. I also wanted to mention that we did do a survey with a number of people who have come to our webinars, and one of the things that you talked to us about was that you were very interested in us dealing with bullying and cyberbullying. So I just wanted to let you know that we have been listening, and we put together entire months. So for August, we will be focusing on bullying and cyberbullying, and we have 4 webinars coming up on those topics. We have the likes of Professor Donna Cross. We also have our lead researcher, Erin Ersek. We've got Maggie Dent, Johnny Shannon. So we have a number of very well regarded people in those areas who will be running webinars for us and podcasts across the month of August. So please do check back and join us in August. And we're delighted to say that tomorrow night we have the very funny, very witty Luke Cook, who is fast becoming a superstar in Hollywood, but he's also becoming a first-time father, and he shares with us those insights on our podcast tomorrow night. So please, a lot to take in, but we look forward to joining you next week. Have a great weekend, everybody. And again, thank you so much to Dr. Justine Gatt for tonight's webinar. Be safe, and we'll talk to you again next week.